Yeah, yeah. We can put it to music.
So, welcome. Let's see, today is January 5th, 2025. Soto Zen. So today we're gonna have a way-seeking mind talk. And I did want to say a couple words about why we do it and why that's a tradition, a sort of Zen Buddhist tradition. I mean, let's see, what could I say? Um, let's see, I think one of the reasons that we do that is because it lets somebody say their sort of spiritual biography. So maybe the circumstances that brought them to Zen Buddhist practice. And, I mean, often I've heard a lot of these kind of talks, but sometimes they include things like turning points in somebody's life or like some moment of clarity. I mean, things like that. But it can maybe sheer luck, an accidental, thing that happens that brings somebody to the practice. Another thing about these talks is that they really build connection and encouragement and trust because they put somebody at the center of the group, and then we get to know them a little better. So one of the things that I think is very useful about that is that Zen Buddhism's often, can be a little bit highfalutin, sort of intellectualized, but when people tell their story, you see that the path is very human and like very relatable and achievable, and that we all come in all different stripes, so to speak. I think when you listen to people speak, sometimes it's one of the things that works for me is to make my intention to listen for similarities, like a lot like in an AA meeting. I mean, when people tell their story in AA, I try to listen for the ways we're alike and not so much for the ways that we're different, and then I find that helpful. Let's see, what else do I want to say? I want to say I think that when you hear other people tell their story, you can see how they've integrated the practice into their life, like day to day. So that's very helpful for people. Like, how can I use this to my benefit in my day to day life? So that's been useful for me. Let's see. I think another reason is that, just the seeing people show gratitude for the path, for our path in particular. So that, and then that the person feels supported in their spiritual their spiritual journey in that sort of way. And then I guess the last thing I wanted to say was that, like, I've been reading about this thing called emergence. Like, it's really on my mind a lot. But it's emergence is this quality that comes forward that's not possible just by a single entity. Like, it's like the difference between a drop of water and then the ocean. Like, one drop of water doesn't display the qualities of like wetness, but you have to have a lot of them together for that to emerge. Or another would be like an ant, like a single ant alone is very like simple creature, but you put them together and then you get this collective wisdom that's kind of like ant hill. Like an ant hill is very complicated and interesting. So when you hear way seeking mind talks, you can see how each person's practice it it let's see it contributes to the collective understanding of the group, and that's where the wisdom emerges. Like, I mean, alone in my head, I'm like, kind of dangerous. Like, I mean, as they say in AA, my mind is a dangerous neighborhood. I should never go there alone. So it's very useful for me to hear other people's stories because this thing, comes forward that I think the collective wisdom of the group is very powerful. So that's why I think that we do these talks, and that's what I find valuable in them. So, and that's the reason that we're having one today. So let's say, having said all that, I want to introduce Bob Smith, who everybody knows quite well, I think. Bob's a longtime Zen Buddhist practitioner, and he's a martial arts enthusiast, I think most probably an expert. And he's got an interesting and long practice history. And so it's with lots of great affection and pride that Bob's gonna give us his thought today, and I'm so happy that you're here. So Bob, there you go.
Oh, thanks, Kurt.
Sure.
I want to know how I came to the discipline of Buddhism and Zen, and many come to Zen as a result of some life-changing occurrence, and mine's a little more gradual. So I really have to talk a little bit about life, my life at any rate. The stage had to be set early on. I was born in Idaho Falls, Idaho in 1939. My early childhood was in Firth, a town of about 300 people. And during the early years of World War II, my early childhood was a rough year of bad farm prices. My dad went back to teaching. My mother was also teaching, so we were renting an apartment from a farm family. And I was left at the age of 3 pretty much on my own. Although the family was supposed to keep an eye on me, my only companion was the farmer's dog. Me, the dog, and I played on the canal bank, chased frogs, and bugged the hogs. I don't think I connected with many other kids until I started school. It's probably why I am okay with isolation. This brings up an important point. I had no siblings, and not having any siblings leaves a real hole in one's socialization. You don't learn how to live with younger or older children in the family. In 1943, we moved to my maternal grandmother's house in Harrison, Idaho, another town of about 600. My father was working at the shipyards in Richmond, California. My grandmother was the first of her family born here. They immigrated from northern Finland about 1880. Harrison's a small town on Coeur d'Alene Lake. The house was at extreme one end of town when almost no kids lived in that area. It was not a time of plenty. We fished and grew our own vegetables. Those were the days of no inside bathrooms, living with a wood stove. Some will remember rationing during the war. Without ration stamps, there were no gas, no sugar, no coffee, no tires, etc. Filling a wood box on washing days or doing fruit canning was a major chore. This was really chop wood, carry water. Since there was no bathtub, we carried a bar of soap to the lake in the summer, and in the winter we poured heated water off the stove into a wash tub in the kitchen. I didn't think we were deprived any more than anybody else during the 40s. That was just the way it was. But in 1945, my mother took a job teaching in Harrison, and I started school. School building housed all 12 grades. Recreation was forest or lake oriented. There wasn't any flat spots in that town. A couple of years later, we moved to Orange, California, where I had my first real encounter with organized religion. When we first moved to the city of Orange, my father got a room with a local Episcopal priest in return for directing the choir. Over the years, we gravitated to becoming sporadic attendees. The youth group provided some social life, and I spent a year as an acolyte. We moved into a series of rented houses. In 1953, my parents purchased their first house. We did the usual things, long bicycle rides. Areas are now covered by houses, beach combing, roaming the creek bed, etc., always accompanied by one constant, the dog. He was about 80 pounds and not very friendly, so my mother never worried about us when we went on camping trips. I was missing something spiritual, but I probably didn't recognize it at the time. When I started high school, baseball and work took over weekends and summers. Even the summer vacations back in the lake were out. I worked primarily for a couple of orchard owners, part-time repairing irrigation lines, picking avocados, cutting wood, painting, whatever was needed. In most of these endeavors, I worked either alone or with a very small group. A lot of them were migrant laborers. My parents were not antisocial, but never particularly social. We did not host any events and seldom attended any. My father was the youngest of 3. My mother was the oldest of 4 girls. While my paternal grandparents were not well off, being teachers, they survived the Depression. My maternal grandfather died in 1925. leaving my grandmother unemployed with 4 children, 2 under 2 years old. Hence, my mother had to bear a lot of the effort in making ends meet and helping care for her little sisters. I feel I gave her a no-nonsense manner. My father, on the other hand, was more of a sense of humor, but also made good use of sarcasm when I screwed up. I don't think my mother was an enthusiastic parent after raising her sisters. My dad had more of a relaxed attitude toward things. Even so, he was a bit of a nitpicker, something I seem to have inherited. So there were conflicting attitudes. Neither was terribly demonstrative. I think that may have influenced my difficulty in expressing emotion. I definitely felt something was lacking, however. After graduating from high school, I left Southern California for the University of Idaho in Moscow. I was the 3rd generation to be associated with that university, and that was in the late 1950s, so Beat generation was in full swing in San Francisco, and to some degree even in Southern California. Many of us in that area were enamored of the Beat philosophy and curious about the thing called Zen. Between classes and a year of baseball injury ended, there was no time for much else except perhaps some unwinding. There was no obvious Buddhist influence at the U at that time, and there was a Beat interest even there. North Idaho was pretty much out of the mainstream. So the next year brought a full schedule of academia and summer work during the school session. Summers were spent surveying for the Forest Service, roads and facilities, and fighting fires. Later, I ran a survey crew for the Forest Service in the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska. I often preferred the forest and the solitude of the trees. At night, when you look up at the stars, it's truly spiritual. Probably why I'm drawn to Gary Snyder's writing. I graduated in forestry in 1962 and found an almost non-existent job market in the field I was in. Since I had the basics in engineering curriculum, I went back to school in civil engineering. The time in Alaska, in the last couple of years I was in school, was mostly in the wilds. It took some getting used to the frequent rain, and very short nights. The primary project was surveying for a road into a roadless area in the upper Russian River, frequented by moose, mountain goats, and brown bears. We never had to use a rifle, even though every crew had to have one. Moose were more common than bears and possibly more ill-tempered. The creeks were red with salmon, which kept the bears busy. The camp dogs let us know when anything was around. I left in the fall of 1963 to return to school, and the earthquake hit in the spring of '64. We drove back to Moscow on the mostly unpaved Alcan Highway and spent the first night sleeping in the car outside Whitehorse in the Yukon Territory. The Northern Lights were really putting on a display. Watching the Northern Lights might be considered a spiritual experience. There's nothing vaguely similar. As I think back, just sitting and observing the lake, the woods at night, with only the natural sounds, was one of my favorite pastimes. Probably my first meditation experience. After graduated in '64 with a degree in civil engineering, I began to work for the Bureau of Reclamation in Boise. I met Lynn on a blind date, and we were married shortly after I left the Bureau and moved to Helena to work in the geotechnical field. And of course, there came a dog. The company in Helena was small, and 6-day weeks were not uncommon. Because of the rural setting, there was a lot of out-of-town travel and extended work on construction projects. Spirituality was merely a reoccurring thought. We made occasional trips to the local Episcopal church, but it never caught on. If I'd been missing something spiritual, I didn't have or take the time to pursue it. Soon thereafter came children, first a stepdaughter, age 6, then 2 girls and a boy. I took a year off in 1969 to do graduate work. We had to sell a small house in the Helena Valley, very comfortable even in the depths of winter, which at one time were pretty severe. One 3-week period had a high temperature of 10 below zero, and the lows were about 40 below. Our time in Moscow was long days and often nights, in class and in the laboratory. We had 1 year to do all the coursework. Graduate students' housing was a series of small houses that came from Farragut Naval Base on Pend Oreille Lake, complete with plywood walls and an oil heater. We had 2 bedrooms, the price was right. The year after we left, they were torn down. We had 3 children when we moved to Moscow. The youngest were 2 and 6 months. A great many other families were in the same boat. The schedule put Lynn in a position of bearing the brunt of the logistics of living in child care. Of course, the dog moved in on Halloween night and refused to leave. He stayed with us most of the year. There were a large number of foreign students now, and although I didn't become involved, there probably were meditation groups. When we returned to Helena, we bought a 2-story brick house, 100 years old. Unfortunately, it had little insulation. You needed to run upstairs at night before your feet froze. The price was right. The 1935 earthquake left cracks in the rubble foundation, and various creatures had made their home in the brick walls. We had to warn the kids not to walk under the eaves, where the icicles often were 10 feet long. Ice under the washing machine and frost coming in through the keyhole in the front door. Once we snapped the gear shift off in the company van in the cold weather. 1973, I returned to Boise to the transportation department. Although Helena remains one of my favorite places, Lynn was glad to leave winter. Again, there was little time to give to anything but work and family. Zen was still the mysterious thing that Kerouac and others wrote about. Suzuki Roshi and the San Francisco Zen Center were not well known in Montana, nor as far as I know in southern Idaho yet. 1977, we relocated to the Bay Area to employment with a consulting firm in San Francisco and residence in Novato. Initially, the idea was to design and do construction consultation on an earth dam in West Marin called Sulahuli. For the first years, I think I seldom saw the town I lived in during the daylight. Long days and weekend worst plus commute time. This was the time Green Gulch was being developed. I knew of it, but never took the time to actually visit. I'm not sure I knew much of anything about Zen Center. What an opportunity to taste Zen, and I didn't take it. I don't think I read anything without numbers. After 1981, I was working in Novato. Free time then was spent doing kid things. Gymnastics meets, coaching baseball, and work. The son started martial arts training in San Rafael. I spent time talking about philosophy with the instructor and started reading Asian martial arts philosophy. It kind of opened the door a little bit. When 1985 downturn came, we returned to Boise again with the transportation department. Later, I was the assistant materials engineer and research manager. Except for regular travel, both in-state and nationally, I was home on weekends. My father died shortly after we returned to Boise. The shipyard's work caught up with him. I managed to arrange some business trips to assist my mother, who had returned to the house on the lake. This was the point at which impermanence became real. I began reading about Zen, primarily Christmas Humphreys, D.T. Suzuki, who was over my head at the time, and 3 Pillars of Zen. I wasn't actively sitting, but the curiosity was there. The philosophy resonated. I began training in karate in 1987. The school was headquartered in Honolulu. My instructor and his instructors and the head of the school were all of Japanese ancestry. There's a strong philosophical or even spiritual aspect to many of the martial arts. It seems like some specific occurrence or experience leads people to approach Buddhism. As I look back, my childhood, although perhaps a little lonely, was not particularly difficult. And I suffered no life-threatening traumas or setbacks as a teenager. At some point, the specter of impermanence of life raises its head. Suddenly, the issue of life and death becomes real. My mother died in 1997 after a lingering illness. Seeing her physical deterioration between my visits north was testimony. Since her younger sister lived in the same neighborhood, she did not want to leave her house until it became a necessity. By that time, time travel was out of the question for her. When we moved to Boise, our kids were either out of or in high school, so now I had time to pursue other opportunities. Of course, I got involved with the local baseball scene. So in addition to coaching in Novato, I spent 6-7 years in Boise coaching baseball at the 14 to 17 age levels. My entry in the martial arts world became a 35-year association with Okinawan Karate, including 7 years as dojo sensei. Karate was a catalyst to renewing my involvement with Zen. The head of the karate school in Honolulu was a lifelong Buddhist. I had the opportunity to visit several temples in Hawaii during trips for tournaments. While there was still a full amount of travel for work, I had more time for thought. My responsibilities in the research area required some out-of-state travel and involvement with peers from across the country and some international contacts. I still found myself uncomfortable with large groups and a need to participate as much as I would have liked to, sit in the back and be invisible. The world doesn't allow that. Maybe that's a form of suffering. Something was still missing, so I was back reading, and perhaps that was my introduction to Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. A friend told me there was a Zen meditation group that he attended. This was the first time I was aware of the opportunity to try Zazen. I think it was 1998. I sat with the Beginner's Mind Sangha, a Thich Nhat Hanh lineage, briefly. At 60, trying to understand the issue of life and death took on more importance. My memory for sequence is not really good now, but I attended a community education class on Zen given by Brian Goller. The Zen he described sounded like what I had been seeking. In roughly that same time frame, I attended a public talk by Layla Smith Bockhorst at the Log Cabin Learning Center in Boise. Layla was leading a weekend retreat on the following 2 days, and I participated in one day. Now I was beginning to sit sporadically. Now I believed I had found the seed of discovery and found to sit for at least 20 minutes daily for at least 30 days to attempt to develop a consistent practice. Next was a Change Your Mind Day in 2003, sponsored by Tricycle Magazine and nationally and locally by several Buddhist groups in Boise. Now I started sitting regularly with the Floating Cloud Sangha, so named because it had no fixed abode. Meditation and book study alternated between Brian's and John Connor's house. In spring of 2004, I saw an advertisement for a weekend retreat in Helena, Montana, led by Layla. I had just retired and had the time. It was difficult. My knees hurt early on, but I survived. Interestingly, the final day of the retreat was Bill Milton's Jukai. So my first retreat experience came at the age of 65. Better late than never. When I first returned to Boise, I was amazed by the degree of Buddhist activity that was occurring outside my narrow view. The Dalai Lama came to Sun Valley and gave a public address. The newspaper referred to the 500 Boise folks making the trip on what was called the Buddhist buses. Now, I gave the experiential side of Zen more effort and continued what I hoped was a consistent sitting practice. I asked Layla for recommendations regarding attending a short session. At that time, I wasn't sure I could survive 7 days. I'm even less sure now. She recommended being a guest student at Green Gulch. In April 2006, I spent a week as a guest student, and my association with Green Gulch began. I started a 6 or 7 year involvement with the Green Gulch Watershed Workweek. The monastic experience was new to my practice, and I think a very necessary experience. Sitting with others and joining in the forums enhanced the experience and added something very different from my normal practice, although I'm still comfortable sitting alone. In 2007, I asked Layla for permission for lay ordination. This became an almost 2 year of effort. Being sewing challenged was the first hurdle. I was not able to attend the sewing session, and sewing my rakusu took sessions at home, at the Helena retreat, and at Layla's home. I had no clue as to what an invisible stitch was, and discovered that cloth, when ironed, doesn't shrink equally in both directions. My Jukai was in Boise on February 8th, 2009. I made it a priority to attend the Open Circle Sangha in Helena annually until COVID restricted travel. During the last Helena retreat before COVID, Bill Milton was ordained, San Francisco Zen Center had its first cattle rancher priest. I had the good fortune to attend 2 3-day sessions at the Ashland, Oregon Zen Center and attend a 3-day retreat in Bozeman, Montana, led by Sojun Mel Weissman. Visiting our 2 daughters living in the Bay Area provided the opportunity to sit with Layla at the Aikido dojo in Corte Madera and in San Rafael, as well as attend the Sunday sessions at Green Gulch during each trip to the Bay Area. It's been our good fortune to have several teachers come to Boise periodically. Leslie James, who is a Twin Falls, Idaho native, made 2 visits each year for several years for weekend retreats. Since becoming a grandparent with the COVID travel restrictions, she's been unable to visit, to the disappointment of the Sangha. Layla has often stopped in Boise on the way through to or from Montana. She made special trips for John Connor's Jukai and his wedding and my Jukai. Steve Stuckey led a 3-day retreat here in the summer of 2013. On the final day, his Dharma talk was under the trees at the Boise Botanical Garden. I often thought that Dharma required a 500-mile trip in almost any direction from Boise, but it came to us quite often. With the opening of the 7th Street Zendo in February 2016 by Peter Vandersteer, the clouds have been given a home. Since the days of COVID, sitting practice with others had to be virtual. Thanks, Zoom. Lynn and I have been in the same house in Boise for more than 35 years, and it shows its age. 2 of the girls are in the Bay Area, Leslie and Sebastopol, and Stacy is an ER nurse at Kaiser in San Rafael. Lisa, at 64, the oldest, passed away in 2023, and Russell, the youngest, is currently living with us temporarily. He's on disability, which provides nowhere near enough money to pay rent. That situation and trying to learn patience is a big part of my current practice. Lynn and I both feel anxiety and a sense of urgency that comes with aging and being essentially caregivers. I heartily recommend Lou Richmond's book on aging as a spiritual practice, as well as Sue Moon's This Is Getting Old. Bodhi, the dog, and I take our gratitude walk every day, most often in the foothills. That and Zazen are constants. Recently, I have rekindled relationships with a number of old friends that go back to junior high, and some of those from college or work. I didn't maintain relationships well, and several of those I knew well have passed, and I feel the loss. Somewhat of a miracle that there are many of us still here. As Taigen Danglet and Leighton said, it is a miracle that we as humans are here at all. 2 other comments have also stuck in my mind. Suzuki Roshi, I think, paraphrased Dogen saying, life is one continuous mistake. Joko Beck cautioned that after years of Zazen, you will find you have received nothing from it. Not knowing, no gaining. Thanks.
Bob, thank you. That was gorgeous. Shall we sit for a couple minutes? I'll ring a bell.